Some animals never forget the people who once became their entire world, and sometimes that memory can become terrifying. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. The loud emergency siren echoed across the sanctuary just as Emily Carter stepped out of the black SUV and stared at the massive steel enclosure in front of her. Her hands trembled slightly as the cold morning wind swept across the property, carrying with it the distant sound of shouting employees and pounding metal. Somewhere inside the gorilla habitat, something huge slammed violently against a reinforced barrier. Emily froze instantly. She had not heard that sound in nearly 20 years, but somehow her body remembered it before her mind did. "Ma'am, you need to stay back right now," a security guard shouted as he rushed past her toward the enclosure gates. More staff members appeared from different directions, their radios crackling with panic. Several tourists were being escorted away from the viewing area, while children cried in confusion. Emily's chest tightened as another deafening boom shook the glass walls ahead of her. Then she heard it. A roar so deep and powerful that it seemed to vibrate through the ground beneath her feet. Her breathing stopped. Daniel Brooks, the sanctuary director, hurried toward her with a tense expression on his face. "Emily, this was a mistake," he said quickly. "I told you he hasn't reacted well to strangers in years." Emily barely heard him. Her eyes remained fixed on the enormous enclosure ahead, where shadows moved rapidly behind thick security glass. Another violent slam echoed through the habitat. Somewhere inside, a full-grown silverback gorilla was losing control, and that gorilla's name was Koba. 20 years earlier, Emily had bottle-fed him as a helpless infant after poachers killed his mother deep in the Congo rainforest. She had carried him wrapped in blankets against her chest. She had slept beside him during storms when he was too frightened to rest alone. Back then, Koba used to cling to her arm like a child afraid of being abandoned. But that was before he became one of the largest silverbacks in the sanctuary. Before the separation. Before the years passed without a single reunion. "He saw your car pull in," Daniel said nervously. "The moment he recognized you, he started acting like this." Emily slowly looked toward him. "Recognized me?" she whispered. Daniel hesitated before answering. "We're not sure, but he hasn't behaved this way in over 6 years." Another roar exploded from inside the habitat, louder this time. Emily instinctively stepped forward despite the fear rising in her chest. A young keeper named Jake Reynolds suddenly ran out through the security doors, breathing hard. "He's throwing objects now," Jake warned. "Dr. Morgan wants authorization for tranquilizers if he keeps escalating." Emily's face turned pale. "No," she said immediately. "Please don't hurt him." Jake exchanged a worried glance with Daniel. "Emily," Daniel said carefully, "you don't understand how dangerous he is now." But before she could answer, the massive gorilla suddenly appeared behind the thick glass wall only 50 feet away. Emily's heart nearly stopped. Koba towered over everyone nearby, his broad shoulders rising and falling heavily as he stared directly at her with dark, unblinking eyes. Then he slammed both hands against the reinforced glass so hard that nearby visitors screamed and stumbled backward in fear. The entire viewing area shook. Security guards rushed forward. Radios erupted with frantic voices. But Emily couldn't move. Because through all the chaos, through all the panic surrounding them, one horrifying realization slowly settled into her mind. Koba was not looking at the guards. He was not looking at the staff. He was only looking at her. Emily could still remember the first time she saw Koba. He had been no larger than a toddler, curled beside his mother beneath heavy rain deep in the Congolese rainforest while rescue teams searched the area. After reports of illegal poaching activity near the reserve, the other gorillas had already fled into the jungle by the time Emily and her team arrived. But the infant refused to leave his mother's side. Even after hours passed, he stayed there trembling and crying softly into her fur. Emily had been only 26 years old back then, a young wildlife caretaker volunteering overseas with almost no experience raising gorillas. But the moment she saw the tiny infant staring up at her with terrified eyes, something inside her changed forever. He will not survive alone. one ranger told her that night as thunder rolled across the dark jungle. Emily knew he was right. Infant gorillas depended completely on their mothers for years. Without constant care, Koba would die within days. So she made a decision that would eventually define the next chapter of her life. She took him home to the sanctuary. At first, Koba refused to eat. He hid beneath blankets in the corner of the nursery room and cried through most nights, especially whenever storms passed overhead. Emily spent countless hours sitting beside him on the floor, speaking softly until he finally trusted her enough to climb into her lap. Slowly, the frightened infant began following her everywhere. Staff members joked that Koba believed he was human because he copied nearly everything Emily did. If she sat, he sat. If she laughed, he became excited and bounced around the room. Some mornings he would even wait outside the bathroom door whining impatiently until she came back out. "You spoiled him," Dr. Lisa Morgan once teased years ago with a smile. "He is going to think you are his mother forever." Back then, Emily secretly hoped that might be true. Over time, Koba grew stronger and more intelligent than anyone expected. He learned hand signals quickly, solved feeding puzzles faster than older gorillas, and became deeply attached to Emily in ways that surprised the sanctuary staff. Whenever she left for meetings, Koba would sit by the nursery window waiting for her truck to return. Sometimes he refused meals until she came back. Visitors loved watching the young gorilla interact with her because the bond between them felt almost unreal. But as the years passed, the sanctuary directors became concerned. Silverback gorillas could eventually weigh over 400 pounds, and experts warned that emotional dependence on humans could become dangerous once Koba reached adulthood. Emily fought against the decision for months, but deep down she already knew they were right. Koba needed to live among his own kind. The transfer happened on a cold October morning. Emily remembered every painful second of it. Koba was 7 years old when the staff moved him into the adult habitat for the first time. At first, he did not understand what was happening. He simply sat beside the locked gate waiting for Emily to come get him like she always did. But when the hours passed and she never returned, something changed in him. He became quiet. Too quiet. "You cannot go back in there," Daniel Brooks had warned her back then. "If you keep visiting him like before, he will never bond with the troop." Emily listened because she believed it was the right thing to do for Koba's future, but leaving him behind destroyed her emotionally. Within a year, she accepted a wildlife rehabilitation job in Montana and moved across the country, trying to convince herself that distance would make the separation easier. She avoided calling the sanctuary after a while because hearing updates about Koba hurt too much. But now, standing outside his enclosure, nearly 20 years later, while alarms echoed through the sanctuary around her, Emily realized something terrifying. Maybe Koba had never forgotten her either. The tension around the enclosure only grew worse as more sanctuary employees arrived near the viewing platform carrying emergency equipment Emily wished she had never seen. 2 veterinary technicians wheeled out a metal case containing tranquilizer supplies, while another worker closed off the public pathways with bright orange barriers. Families were quietly escorted toward the parking area, but many visitors kept stopping to stare back at the massive gorilla standing behind the reinforced glass. Koba had not moved from that spot once. His dark eyes remained locked on Emily with an intensity that made her uneasy in ways she could not explain. "This is exactly why I warned you," Daniel said under his breath while speaking into his radio. Sweat covered his forehead despite the cold morning air. "He has been unstable ever since he saw you." Emily looked back toward the enclosure. Koba slowly paced in circles now, his huge hands brushing across the concrete floor before he suddenly stopped again and stared directly at her. There was something deeply unsettling about the way he watched her, almost as if he were studying every movement she made. "What happened to him after I left?" Emily asked quietly. Daniel hesitated before answering. At first, things were normal. He adapted to the troop better than expected. But about 8 years ago, his behavior changed. Emily frowned. "Changed how?" Before Daniel could answer, Dr. Lisa Morgan approached them carrying a clipboard against her chest. Unlike the others, she looked more concerned than frightened. "He became withdrawn," she explained softly. Koba stopped interacting with visitors. Then eventually he stopped bonding with new keepers too. Emily listened carefully while another loud bang echoed behind the glass. Koba had struck one of the walls again, causing nearby employees to flinch nervously. There were incidents, Daniel admitted. Nothing catastrophic, but enough to make everyone cautious around him. Emily crossed her arms tightly against the cold. What kind of incidents? Jake stepped closer before Daniel could respond. A few years ago, one of the younger handlers entered the feeding corridor too quickly. Koba cornered him and would not let him leave for almost 20 minutes. Emily's face paled slightly. Did he hurt him? No, Jake answered. That was the strange part. He just stood there blocking the exit while staring at him. Dr. Morgan nodded slowly, almost like he was searching for something. Another uncomfortable silence settled between them. Emily could hear Koba breathing heavily even through the thick glass barrier. Every few seconds he released a low rumbling sound deep in his chest that seemed to vibrate through the enclosure walls. And now he sees me after 20 years and reacts. Like this, she whispered. Daniel looked toward the gorilla uneasily. You do not understand what he has become, Emily. He is over 400 pounds now. One wrong moment, and things could spiral out of control very fast. Emily tried to focus on the fear in Daniel's voice, but something about Koba's behavior felt wrong to her. Yes, the silverback looked agitated. Yes, his movements were unpredictable. But deep down, she sensed something else beneath the chaos. Something emotional. Koba suddenly moved closer to the glass again, causing several guards to raise their tranquilizer rifles instinctively. Emily noticed his breathing quicken as he stared directly at her neck. Not her face, not her hands, her neck. She frowned in confusion. Then slowly, almost unconsciously, she touched the silver necklace resting beneath her jacket collar. The moment her fingers brushed against it, Koba froze completely. Every sound inside the enclosure seemed to stop at once. Even the sanctuary staff noticed the sudden change. The massive gorilla tilted his head slightly, his eyes fixed intensely on the necklace hidden beneath Emily's coat. Then, for the first time since she arrived, Koba took a slow step backward instead of forward. Jake lowered his voice nervously. Why is he looking at you like that? Emily swallowed hard as memories began surfacing in her mind. Because hidden inside that old silver necklace was something she had not shown anyone in almost 20 years. A tiny folded piece of faded blue fabric cut from the blanket she once wrapped around Koba as a baby. Emily slowly pulled the silver necklace from beneath her jacket, while every employee around her watched nervously from a distance. The tiny chain trembled in her hand as morning light reflected softly off the worn pendant. Inside the pendant was the faded blue fabric she had carried with her for nearly 2 decades without ever explaining why. Koba remained completely motionless behind the reinforced glass, his massive chest rising and falling slower now as his dark eyes followed every movement she made. Even the security guard seemed uncertain what to do next. Do not move any closer, Daniel warned immediately. When Emily took a cautious step forward, we still do not know how he is going to react. But Emily barely heard him. Her attention stayed fixed on Koba's face. The aggressive energy that had filled the enclosure minutes earlier was fading, replaced by something far stranger. Confusion, recognition, almost disbelief. Dr. Lisa Morgan slowly lowered the tranquilizer rifle she had been holding beside one of the technicians. His pupils changed, she whispered quietly. Jake frowned. What does that mean? It means he is focusing, Dr. Morgan replied. He is not reacting out of aggression anymore. Emily swallowed hard as another memory surfaced in her mind. Years ago, during Koba's first winter at the sanctuary nursery, he had become terrified of loud thunderstorms. Every time lightning struck, the infant gorilla would hide beneath a blue blanket Emily kept beside his sleeping crate. Eventually, he refused to sleep without it. One night, after Koba finally fell asleep in her arms, Emily cut away a tiny corner of the blanket and folded it inside a silver pendant necklace as a reminder of the bond they shared. She had worn it ever since. He remembers the blanket, Emily whispered softly. Daniel stared at her in disbelief. Emily, that is impossible. But before anyone could say another word, Koba suddenly moved again. Several guards instantly tensed, raising their weapons halfway. Emily's heart jumped as the massive silverback began walking directly toward the front viewing glass. His enormous hands pressed against the concrete floor with slow, deliberate movements. Every step seemed careful now, almost hesitant. Tourists watching from behind the barriers held their breath in silence. Koba stopped only a few feet from the glass, separating him from Emily. For several seconds, neither of them moved. Emily could see every detail of his aged face now. The gray spreading across his shoulders. The thin scar above one eye from an old dominance dispute years earlier. But what affected her most were his eyes. They no longer looked wild. They looked emotional. Deeply emotional. Koba slowly lifted one massive hand and placed it gently against the thick glass barrier between them. Emily felt tears sting her eyes instantly. That hand had once been small enough to wrap around two of her fingers. Jake stared in shock beside her. "I have never seen him this calm," he whispered. Dr. Morgan nodded quietly without taking her eyes off Koba. "Neither have I." Emily hesitated only a moment before lifting her own trembling hand toward the glass. The instant her palm touched the surface opposite Koba's hand, the giant gorilla released a deep sound from his chest unlike anything the staff had heard before. It was soft, almost broken, a low rumbling cry that seemed filled with years of loneliness and confusion. Several employees exchanged stunned looks. Even Daniel appeared shaken now. Then suddenly Koba pulled away from the glass and turned sharply toward the back corner of the enclosure. The peaceful moment shattered instantly. "What is he doing now?" Jake asked nervously. Koba began moving quickly across the habitat, disappearing briefly behind a cluster of artificial rocks near the rear wall. Loud crashing sounds echoed from the enclosure again as objects shifted somewhere out of sight. Security guards immediately grabbed their radios. "Everyone back away from the glass," one of them ordered. Emily stepped backward reluctantly as tension surged through the viewing platform once more. Daniel motioned urgently toward the veterinary team. "Get ready," he warned under his breath. But Dr. Morgan narrowed her eyes toward the far side of the habitat. "Wait," she said quietly. "He is carrying something." A few seconds later, Koba reappeared from behind the rocks, holding an old rusted metal box tightly against his chest. Every person on the viewing platform stood frozen as Koba slowly approached the glass, carrying the rusted metal box against his chest with surprising care. The enormous silverback no longer looked aggressive. If anything, he looked protective, almost nervous, as though the object he carried mattered more to him than anything else inside the enclosure. Emily could hear her own heartbeat pounding inside her ears while the sanctuary staff cautiously backed away from the glass. Nobody understood what they were seeing. Daniel stared in disbelief. "Where did he get that?" he whispered. Jake shook his head slowly. "I have worked here for years. I have never seen that box before." Koba stopped directly in front of Emily once again. For several long seconds, he simply sat there holding the old container while his dark eyes moved between the box and the silver necklace hanging from Emily's trembling hand. Then, incredibly gently for an animal his size, Koba lowered the box onto the concrete floor near the glass wall. Dr. Morgan stepped closer carefully, her voice barely above a whisper. "He is showing it to her." Emily's chest tightened painfully. The rusted container looked old, far older than anything else inside the habitat. Years of scratches covered the surface, and one side appeared slightly bent as if it had been carried around for a very long time. Koba rested one massive hand on top of the box and released another low rumbling sound from deep in his chest. The sound was softer now, sadder somehow. Emily felt tears forming again before she even understood why. "Open the maintenance hatch," she said quietly. Daniel looked at her like she had lost her mind. "Absolutely not. Please," Emily begged without taking her eyes off Koba. "He is trying to show me something." "Emily, that is still a 400-pound silverback gorilla," Daniel snapped nervously. "One unpredictable movement, and somebody gets hurt." But Dr. Morgan continued studying Koba carefully. "Daniel," she said slowly, "look at his body language." Daniel frowned. "What about it?" "He is not displaying dominance. He is not threatening anyone. If anything, he looks emotional." Another silence followed. Koba remained seated near the glass, occasionally glancing at Emily before looking back down at the metal box beside him. The giant silverback almost appeared anxious, waiting for her reaction. Finally, Daniel exhaled heavily and rubbed his forehead. "Open the small transfer hatch only," he ordered reluctantly into his radio. "Nobody goes inside the enclosure." A nearby employee unlocked a narrow maintenance compartment built into the lower section of the viewing barrier. The opening was just large enough for small objects to pass through. Safely, Koba watched every movement closely. Emily slowly approached the hatch while her hands shook uncontrollably. The moment she crouched near the opening, Koba carefully pushed the rusted metal box toward her with astonishing gentleness. Emily could barely breathe now. Slowly, she pulled the box through the hatch and placed it onto the concrete floor beside her knees. The metal felt cold beneath her fingers, so cold that it sent chills through her entire body. "Oh my God," Jake whispered behind her. Emily hesitated before carefully lifting the rusted lid. The hinges creaked softly as the box opened for the first time in years. The instant Emily looked inside, tears flooded her eyes so suddenly that she could not speak. Resting inside the old container was a tiny baby bottle with faded cartoon animals printed across the side. Beside it lay a worn stuffed giraffe, missing one button eye. Underneath both objects was a folded piece of blue blanket fabric identical to the fragment hidden inside Emily's necklace. Dr. Morgan covered her mouth in shock. Daniel stared silently at the contents like he could not process what he was seeing. But Emily's attention fixed on one final object resting carefully beneath everything else inside the box. It was an old photograph. The edges were bent and weathered with age, but she recognized it instantly. The picture showed a much younger Emily sitting on the nursery floor 20 years earlier, while a tiny infant gorilla slept peacefully against her chest. Emily completely broke down crying. Because somehow, through every passing year, every enclosure change, every separation, and every moment she thought he had forgotten her forever, Koba had kept every memory of her safe. Emily could no longer stop the tears running down her face as she held the old photograph in trembling hands. The edges of the picture were cracked and faded from time, but the memory inside it remained painfully clear. She remembered that exact morning 20 years earlier. Koba had refused to sleep the entire night because of a thunderstorm, and sometime near sunrise he finally curled against her chest and fell asleep while she sat on the nursery floor, wrapped in the blue blanket. One of the sanctuary workers had quietly snapped the photo from the doorway without either of them noticing. Emily thought the picture had been lost years ago, yet somehow, Koba had kept it hidden all this time. Around the viewing platform, nobody spoke. Even the sanctuary staff seemed emotionally overwhelmed by what they were witnessing. Jake slowly removed his glasses and wiped his eyes while staring at the objects inside the metal box. "He saved all of this," he whispered quietly. Dr. Morgan nodded slowly, still stunned herself. "For 20 years. Emily carefully touched the tiny baby bottle resting beside the blanket fabric. The faded cartoon animals printed along the side were nearly invisible now from age and wear. "This was his favorite bottle," she said softly through tears. "He would refuse every other one." Koba sat silently behind the glass watching her examine each object. His massive frame no longer looked intimidating to Emily now. For the first time since arriving at the sanctuary, she no longer saw a dangerous silverback. She saw the frightened, orphaned infant she once carried through the nursery late at night while singing softly to calm him down. Koba released another low rumbling sound deep from his chest. The sound instantly transported Emily backward through time. "You still remember that too," she whispered emotionally. Daniel looked confused. "Remember what?" Emily slowly smiled through tears. "When Koba was little, he used to make that exact sound whenever he wanted comfort." Dr. Morgan stared toward the gorilla in disbelief. "You are telling me he has been carrying emotional attachment memories for 2 decades. Emily looked down at the photograph again before answering. "I think he has been carrying abandonment." The words hit everyone around her harder than expected. Daniel lowered his eyes quietly while guilt spread across his face. Years earlier, he had been one of the people who insisted separating Emily from Koba completely was necessary for the gorilla's development. At the time, it seemed scientifically correct. Emotionally, however, nobody truly understood what the separation might do to him. Koba slowly moved closer to the glass again and sat directly across from Emily. This time he did not pound against the barrier or roar. Instead, he gently rested one hand over his chest while watching her. Emily suddenly remembered something else from long ago. "He used to do that when he was scared," she said softly. "Whenever he could not find me." Jake stared at the silverback with wide eyes. "All these years we thought he was becoming aggressive," he whispered. "Maybe he was just lonely." A heavy silence followed those words. Emily looked around the enormous enclosure surrounding Koba. Despite being one of the largest habitats in the sanctuary, it suddenly felt heartbreaking to her. Artificial rocks, thick glass, concrete pathways, cameras, visitors. Everything designed to protect him somehow looked painfully empty now. Koba lowered his head slightly before pushing the metal box closer toward the glass again. Emily noticed something folded beneath the old photograph that she had not seen before. Carefully, she reached into the container and pulled out a thin, weathered notebook covered in scratches and dirt. Daniel frowned immediately. "What is that?" Emily slowly opened the first page. Her breath caught instantly. Every page inside the notebook was filled with handprints. Hundreds of them. Small handprints pressed into faded paint across nearly every sheet. Tiny infant gorilla prints slowly growing larger over the years. Emily covered her mouth as tears poured harder than before. "Oh my God," she whispered shakily. Dr. Morgan stepped closer to see the pages and suddenly froze. "Wait," she said softly. "Those newer prints are recent." Emily looked up in confusion. Dr. Morgan pointed toward the final pages near the back of the notebook. The handprints there were enormous now, clearly belonging to the fully grown silverback sitting silently behind the glass. Page after page after page. Koba had continued adding new handprints to the notebook long after Emily disappeared from his life. As if he had been waiting all those years for the day she finally came back to see how much he had grown. Emily sat motionless on the concrete floor beside the viewing glass while the worn notebook rested open in her lap. Her fingers slowly traced the enormous handprints covering the final pages, and with every page she turned, the weight of 20 lost years pressed harder against her chest. The tiny infant prints at the beginning looked almost human, small enough to fit into the center of her palm. But page after page, season after season, the prints grew larger until they belonged to the towering silverback, now sitting silently across from her. Koba watched her carefully the entire time, his dark eyes never leaving her face. Around them, the sanctuary had gone completely quiet. Nobody wanted to interrupt the moment unfolding in front of them. Even the tourists who had stayed behind now stood silently near the barriers, many wiping tears from their eyes without fully understanding why the scene felt so emotional. Dr. Morgan slowly crouched beside Emily and looked down at the notebook again. "He kept documenting his growth," she whispered softly, almost like he was trying to save time itself. Emily shook her head slowly through tears. "No," she replied emotionally. "He was waiting for me to come back." Those words seemed to hit Daniel harder than anyone else. The sanctuary director stepped away from the group and stared toward the enclosure in silence, clearly struggling with guilt. For years he had viewed Koba as unstable, dangerous, unpredictable, but now every aggressive behavior suddenly looked different. The pacing, the emotional outbursts, the refusal to bond with handlers. None of it resembled anger anymore. It resembled grief. Jake leaned closer toward Dr. Morgan. "Do gorillas really remember people this long?" he asked quietly. Dr. Morgan never looked away from Koba as she answered. "Not just people," she said softly. "Emotional experiences, loss, comfort, attachment. Their memories can be incredibly deep." Emily carefully closed the notebook and looked back toward Koba through tear-filled eyes. "I am sorry," she whispered. "I should not have left you." The giant silverback immediately released another low rumbling sound from his chest the moment she spoke. It was softer than before, almost soothing now. Koba slowly moved closer to the glass until his face rested only inches away from Emily's reflection. Then something happened that nobody on the viewing platform would ever forget. Koba gently lowered his massive head and closed his eyes. Jake frowned in confusion. "What is he doing?" Emily's voice trembled as she answered. "When he was little, he used to do that whenever he wanted me to hold him." Dr. Morgan covered her mouth as tears filled her own eyes. Even Daniel turned away briefly, overwhelmed by the realization that the silverback had spent years carrying emotional memories nobody around him understood. Emily slowly lifted her trembling hand and placed it against the glass once more. Almost instantly, Koba raised his own enormous hand and matched her position exactly like he had done as an infant decades earlier. The size difference between their hands now looked heartbreaking. Emily began crying harder than before. "You waited for me," she whispered shakily. Koba responded with another deep rumble that vibrated softly through the barrier between them. Nearby staff members lowered their radios completely now. Nobody seemed afraid anymore. For the first time in years, the massive silverback looked peaceful. Truly peaceful. Daniel slowly walked back toward Emily, his expression filled with regret. "All these years," he said quietly, "we thought we were protecting him by separating you." Emily stared at Koba sadly. Maybe some part of him never understood why I disappeared. A heavy silence followed those words. Then suddenly Koba stood up and turned toward the rear section of the enclosure again. Several employees instinctively tensed for a moment, afraid the calm interaction was ending. But Koba did not look agitated. Instead, he walked slowly toward a large artificial tree near the back wall where the sanctuary cameras could barely see him. Emily wiped tears from her face and watched carefully. "What is he doing now?" Jake whispered nervously. Koba reached behind the artificial tree and carefully pulled something loose from a hidden space near the rocks. At first nobody could tell what it was. Then as the silverback slowly returned toward the glass carrying the object carefully, in both hands, Emily's breath caught in her throat all over again. Because what Koba carried this time was not another memory from the past. It was a fresh bouquet of wild yellow flowers. Emily stared through the glass in complete disbelief as Koba slowly approached carrying the bouquet of wild yellow flowers with extraordinary care in his enormous hands. The flowers were slightly crushed and uneven, clearly gathered from different corners of the sanctuary habitat. But to Emily, they looked more beautiful than anything she had ever seen. Every person standing on the viewing platform fell silent once again. Even the distant sounds of radios and tourists seemed to disappear beneath the emotional weight of the moment unfolding in front of them. Koba stopped directly across from Emily and carefully lowered himself onto the concrete floor. Then, with slow, deliberate movements, the massive silverback placed the bouquet gently beside the glass barriers separating them. Emily covered her mouth as fresh tears poured down her face. "No way," Jake whispered behind her, unable to believe what he was seeing. Dr. Morgan shook her head softly in amazement. He brought them to her. Emily's hands trembled as she knelt closer to the glass. She immediately recognized the yellow flowers. Years ago, when Koba was still an infant, Emily used to gather those same flowers near the sanctuary trails and place them beside his sleeping crate because he loved playing with the petals. Sometimes he would fall asleep holding them against his chest like treasures. Emily had not thought about those flowers in nearly 20 years. Yet somehow Koba remembered them too. "You remembered everything," she whispered emotionally. Koba responded with another soft rumbling sound while keeping his eyes fixed on her face. The huge silverback no longer looked intimidating at all now. He looked vulnerable, almost relieved, as if carrying those memories alone for so many years had finally become too heavy. Daniel slowly stepped closer beside Dr. Morgan, his expression overwhelmed with guilt and disbelief. "I cannot explain this scientifically," he admitted quietly. "I have managed sanctuaries for 30 years, and I have never seen emotional recall like this." Dr. Morgan folded her arms while watching Koba carefully. "Maybe we underestimated what grief looks like in animals," she said softly. Emily reached toward the small transfer hatch again, and this time nobody stopped her. Daniel simply nodded silently toward the nearest employee, who unlocked the compartment without hesitation. Emily carefully reached through and pulled the flowers into her hands. The petals smelled fresh and earthy, carrying the faint scent of rain and grass from inside the enclosure. The moment she held them against her chest, Koba released the deepest rumble yet, almost like a sigh. Several people nearby instantly wiped tears from their eyes. Jake quietly looked away for a moment, visibly emotional. Emily smiled through tears as memories flooded back one after another. Koba running through the nursery, holding flowers in both hands. Koba falling asleep beside her chair. Koba crying during thunderstorms until she wrapped him in the blue blanket. Every memory suddenly felt painfully alive again. "I thought you forgot me," Emily whispered shakily. Koba tilted his head slightly, as if listening carefully to every word. Then slowly, incredibly gently, he pressed his forehead against the glass. Emily's breathing caught in her throat. Without hesitation, she leaned forward too, resting her forehead against the opposite side of the barrier. For several seconds, neither of them moved at all. The giant silverback simply closed his eyes while soft rumbling sounds vibrated through the glass between them. Around the sanctuary, employees lowered their radios completely. Some visitors openly cried now, while watching the reunion unfold. Nobody had expected the terrifying emergency earlier that morning to lead to something so heartbreakingly tender. Daniel quietly cleared his throat and looked toward Emily. "Do you know what this means?" he asked softly. Emily slowly pulled back from the glass, while holding the flowers tightly against her chest. "What?" Daniel looked toward Koba before answering. "For 20 years, everyone thought this gorilla became emotionally unstable because he was dangerous." He paused, briefly, struggling to finish the sentence. "But maybe he was never dangerous at all." Emily looked back toward Koba as tears filled her eyes once more. The massive silverback sat peacefully behind the glass, watching her with the same quiet attachment he carried as a baby long ago. Then Doctor Morgan suddenly noticed something unusual near the corner of the enclosure wall and frowned slightly. "Wait a second," she whispered. Jake looked toward her. "What is it?" Doctor Morgan pointed toward a section of concrete hidden partially behind artificial vines near the back of the habitat. "There are marks on the wall." Emily slowly stood up while clutching the flowers. As Koba turned his head toward the corner Doctor Morgan pointed at, sunlight shifted across the enclosure wall and revealed dozens of scratched markings carved carefully into the concrete. Emily's face slowly went pale as she realized what they were. They were tally marks. Hundreds of them. Emily slowly approached the far side of the viewing glass, while sunlight continued spilling across the concrete wall hidden behind the artificial vines. The closer she looked, the harder her breathing became. Hundreds of narrow tally marks had been scratched carefully into the surface over many years. Some were faded and old while others looked recent, but all of them followed the exact same pattern. Groups of 5, line after line after line stretching across nearly the entire wall. Jake stared at them in confusion. "What are those?" he asked quietly. But Emily already knew. Her hand slowly covered her mouth as tears filled her eyes once more. "Days," she whispered shakily. Doctor Morgan frowned. "What?" Emily turned toward them, barely able to speak through the emotion in her voice. "When Koba was little, I used to make tally marks on the nursery wall whenever I had to leave for conferences or overnight field trips." She looked back toward the scratched concrete wall inside the enclosure. "I would always tell him how many days until I came back." Silence swept across the entire viewing platform. Nobody moved. Nobody even seemed to breathe. Daniel slowly looked toward the countless marks covering the enclosure wall, and realization hit him like a wave. "You think he kept counting?" Emily nodded faintly through tears. "I think he was waiting." Koba sat quietly nearby watching her reaction while soft morning wind moved through the trees surrounding the sanctuary. For the first time all day, the silverback looked completely calm. No pacing, no slamming against the glass, no signs of distress at all. It was as if simply seeing Emily again had finally ended something painful inside him that had lasted for decades. Doctor Morgan slowly wiped tears from her cheeks. "All these years," she whispered emotionally, "he was not unstable. He was grieving." Daniel lowered his head in silence. The guilt on his face was impossible to hide now. Every report, every behavioral assessment, every discussion about Koba being dangerous suddenly felt horribly wrong. Emily carefully walked back toward the viewing glass while holding the bouquet of yellow flowers against her chest. Koba immediately moved closer too, sitting directly across from her once more. The giant silverback gently rested one hand against the barrier and stared at her with quiet patience. Emily smiled sadly through tears. "I wish I had come back sooner," she whispered. Koba released another low, comforting rumble that vibrated softly through the glass between them. Nearby visitors openly cried now while watching the emotional reunion unfold. Even the security guards stood silently with lowered radios, completely transformed by what they had witnessed throughout the morning. Jake glanced toward Daniel carefully. "What happens now?" Daniel looked toward Emily and Koba sitting together on opposite sides of the glass before answering quietly. "Now we stop treating him like something broken." Emily slowly sat down beside the barrier once more, exhausted emotionally, but unable to pull herself away. Koba mirrored her movement immediately, lowering himself to the floor on the opposite side exactly like he had done as a baby long ago. For several peaceful minutes, neither of them moved at all. They simply sat there together in silence while sunlight poured through the sanctuary windows around them. Finally, Emily looked down at the old photograph. still resting beside the metal box, and smiled softly through tears. "You kept every memory," she whispered. Koba blinked slowly and tilted his head slightly, almost as if he understood every word. Dr. Morgan stepped beside Daniel quietly. "Do you realize what today means?" she asked softly. Daniel nodded without taking his eyes off the enclosure. "Yes," he admitted. "It means we still do not understand animal emotions nearly as well as we pretend we do." Outside the sanctuary, the afternoon sun slowly began sinking lower across the mountains while visitors quietly drifted away carrying the story they had just witnessed. But inside the enclosure, Koba never once moved away from the glass. Hours later, when Emily finally stood to leave, the giant silverback slowly rose with her